Soraya.
Hey, Jeff.
What do you got there?
I have a book. What do you have there?
I've got a book too.
Oh, Jeff, just tell me about it when it's over.
Yeah, so that's the name of this book, Tell Me When It's Over. And I think I was going to say this is our first author that we're speaking to, but that's not necessarily true because we've had Pat Thomas on the show, but
Yeah.
typically we're speaking to musicians. But today we're speaking to, I don't know if he's technically the author or he's credited as the editor.
Yeah, he's definitely the editor.
So who is this guy?
Clive Jones.
Clive Jones, yeah. So the editor of this book, Tell Me When It's Over.
Notes from the Paisley
Underground. So
yeah,
we're speaking to Clive today, and I'm excited about this because we've had calls to Australia when we spoke to David Faulkner from Hoodoo Gurus. Our buddy Chris Kakavez lives in Germany, so we've had calls to Germany. But today, first call to
the motherland,
the UK, England.
The origin place. But no, it's our first call to the UK, and I'm glad we get to talk with Clive about this book.
Yeah.
That, a number of us have read and talk about our favorite bands. So what say we get started?
Let's do it.
Hi, this is Soraya.
And this is Jeff.
Our podcast is called Paisley Stage Raspberry and Rhyme.
A podcast where the two of us play music that we like and share anecdotes and background about the tunes.
We hope you'll join our conversation. And without further ado, a grooviar.
Let's get groovy. All right. Connecting to England.
Jolly old England.
Well, good evening, Mr. Jones.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing this evening?
Very well, thank you. Hi, Soraya.
Hello. Good to have you on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I'm looking out my window. The sun is shining brightly. It's the middle of the day here. And to you, good sir, it's evening, correct?
Good evening, 7 o'clock here. Yeah, just had something to eat. Yeah.
But see, look at that beautiful backdrop that Clive has. That just speaks volumes to me.
Well, I have quite a long room here, and I've got one wall that's full of my records and CDs, which is so they're all at hand, which is nice.
That's the only way it should be. Readily accessible.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, please go ahead.
Well, I was going to say we're very excited to have you on the show. Obviously, you're a music fan like us. Your background shows that. But we wanted to bring you on to talk about this book that you edited.
Right.
And I noticed that you've written or been a part of several books, mostly about British and Israeli history. Is that correct?
No, that's not me. That must be somebody else.
I was wondering about that too, because you never know. Yeah. And I would imagine that Clive Jones is a relatively common name.
It is, yeah. There's a few of us about.
Okay. So somebody stole your name and wrote a bunch of British history. So
that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we want to talk about this book, right, Soraya?
Yes. And Clive, again, thank you for joining us and our listeners to talk about this book that I think a number of us have in our collection and have read through it. And of course, you know, it addresses a lot of our favorite bands, but it also kind of expands the definition of what Paisley Underground is or what bands were part of it. So before we talk about the specifics of the book, could you please share with our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in pop music right from when I was young. I like bands like the Beatles. I mean, who doesn't like the Beatles? But I became more interested in music when I was at school, about the age of 13, 14. What you tend to find is people either become interested in sport or they become interested in music. And I went the music route. And obviously you get influenced by school friends, people that you're friendly with at school. And looking back, people who had elder brothers and sisters, they pass their tastes on to their siblings and you pick up on them. So in a way, it's quite random what you actually pick up on when you're at school. And it so happened that the bands I picked up on were bands like Pink Floyd, particularly Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd. I became interested in the Canterbury scene, bands like Soft Machine, Caravan, Kevin Ayres. So a lot of the British usual bands of the era. We used to call it underground music then, or progressive rock.
Mm-hmm.
So all the popular bands like Yes, for example, or Genesis, I was interested in them. So started off mainly with the British music scene. But then I had a friend in particular that I met who was really into the American West Coast rock scene. So the San Francisco scene of the 60s, which bands like Quicksilver Messenger Service, Jefferson Airplane, but primarily the Grateful Dead. So the Grateful Dead fairly quickly became my favorite band. So it was basically psychedelic music, also the other West Coast bands, the Los Angeles scene, bands like the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, or the more kind of poppy scene that's going on in Los Angeles in the 60s. And also Captain Beefheart was quite an early favorite of mine.
Wow.
It so happened that around the time I was becoming interested in music, he was coming over and playing here a few times. So I had the opportunity to see Beefheart.
Wow.
So I became a big fan of his. And then in 1974, I got the opportunity to see the Grateful Dead in London. They came over. And I divide the Grateful Dead's career into two parts. They had an era before they took a break in 1975. And I felt when they came back after that, they were never quite as good. So I feel very fortunate to have seen them in that first era when they were really great, I thought.
Nice.
So that was my sort of taste in the 70s. And of course, in the mid to late 70s, you had the punk scene came along. And I became interested in that. At the time, I was living in Stoke-on-Trent, which is not far from Manchester.
Okay.
So there was quite a big punk scene in Manchester, and I could go to Manchester and see various bands. I'm thinking of people like the Buzzcocks, Magazine, Joy Division, The Fall. I was a big fan of The Fall. So, as well as the 60s bands, I had this interested in punk in the 70s. So, when the sort of 80s came around, I actually sort of found there weren't really new bands coming along that were grabbing my interest in quite the same way. In England, there was this kind of new romantic scene, which wasn't really to my taste. In America, you seem to have these sort of heavy metal, big hair bands, which weren't my thing at all. And you had bands like the Smiths here, which were really popular, and I could never really get them. So by the time the sort of 80s came around, I found myself falling out of love with mainstream rock music, I thought. So I was kind of looking around for something else. I was getting into folk music quite a bit. In England, there was a very big folk boom in the 60s, and in the 70s, there was a big folk rock boom. But that kind of passed me by at the time. But in the 80s, I was catching up on that, getting into folk music in a big way. But I was kind of looking for something else to come along and excite me again. And it so happened that I was a member of CND, which was the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. And I was a member of a local branch here. And in 1985, Easter 1985, there was a big demonstration, anti-nuclear demonstration up in a town called Barrow in the north of England.
Okay.
And the local group were going up in a bus. So it was a very long bus journey to get there. And I got on the bus and I had a Sony Walkman on and I was listening to the Grateful Dead. And across the aisle on the bus was a guy who I'd seen before, but I'd never really spoken to him. And he asked me what I was listening to. And I said, well, it's the Grateful Dead, not expecting him to know who the Grateful Dead were. But not only did he know the Grateful Dead were, he actually had all their records, just like me.
Wow.
So this turned out to be a guy called Paul Ricketts. And from that time, I became friends with him. And I lived in a place called Chippenham, and he lived in a place called Calne, which was the next town along from me in Wiltshire. So I started sort of visiting him and looking at all the records he had and borrowing stuff off him. And he had two friends, one of whom was called Steve Lines and the other was called Henry Race. So I became friendly with them. So I sort of joined a group of people there. And it so happened that the thing they were primarily into at the time was the Paisley Underground, which I wasn't really aware of.
Okay.
So they had a lot of records by the Paisley Underground bands, and they subscribed to a magazine called Bucketful of Brains,
Yes.
which was produced here in England,
Yes.
which was edited by a guy called Nigel Cross, who at the time I didn't know, but who subsequently become a friend of mine.
Oh.
And so I quickly subscribed to that magazine, and I sort of devoured each issue as it came out, and I quickly acquired as many of the records as I could. So I fell in love with the bands in a big way. I liked the music. I could see that they were very influenced by psychedelic music, perhaps more Los Angeles and San Francisco, but psychedelic music nevertheless. But they also had, they took the energy from the punk bands and applied that to music as well. So they came up with this synthesis of music that really appealed to me. I also like the idea of a music scene as well. When I become interested in the San Francisco bands or the Canterbury bands, you tend to get into one band and then you look for connections that go off and you kind of follow them and you get interested in other bands.
Right.
So they're all related, and I thought the Paisley Underground bands had that aspect to them. They all seem to be connected, and I've got, I had this romantic idea that they all lived together in Los Angeles in a big house, a bit like the Monkees in the TV show.
Right.
They were all friends, and they didn't have to worry about where the money was coming on. All they were doing was having parties and making music.
Yes.
So that's basically how I got into the Paisley Underground. I sort of fell for the bands in a big way, and I became pretty obsessed with them, I would say. Also, at this time, I became aware of somebody called Pat Thomas in America. I don't know whether you know Pat.
Yes.
So I was kind of aware of him because he was in a band called Absolute Grey on the East Coast of America. And they had a cassette on a cassette label called Acid Tapes out of England, which was run by somebody called Alan Duffy up in Manchester. But Alan Duffy actually stopped running that label, but he passed all his tapes on to my friend Steve Lines in Calne.
Okay.
So Steve was releasing the Absolute Grey cassette. So I was aware of who Pat was. And what he had done was he produced a Dream Syndicate fanzine, and it was called John Coltrane's Stereo News.
Ah.
It only lasted for one issue.
Oh.
But I sent away for it. I wrote to him, sent the money for the magazine, got hold of the magazine, and I started corresponding with him. And I was trading tapes with quite a few people, cassette tapes at the time. So I started trading tapes back and forward with Pat. And I found that we shared very similar tastes. I mentioned I was getting into folk music. Pat was doing the same as well. He was kind of discovering all the British folk music, about people like Richard and Linda Thompson.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a lot in common. I mean, I could learn a lot from him about the Paisley Underground. He'd obviously actually played with some of the bands on the same bill. And so I was trading tapes back and forward with him. And he subsequently became sort of quite a good friend of mine. So, I mean, that's how my interest in the Paisley Underground came about, really. And that's how I kind of got to know about them.
Okay.
So I want to know, who was the starter band for you? What was the first band of the underground, the Paisley Underground, that you became interested in?
I think the first one to hit me was the Dream Syndicate, which I really loved that first album. It sounded to me as if there was quite a large Velvet Underground influence on that record, and obviously they were one of my favourite bands. So I think the Dream Syndicate. But I kind of quickly discovered the rest of the bands. Rain Parade, obviously that first album, Emergency Third Rail Power Trip, which is just an incredible album, really.
It really is. Yeah.
So yeah,
I
and
like
also,
that visual of one
sorry,
band and then branching off. I like
that's
that.
right. Yeah, and you could pick up on the connections between them. So you think, well, if I like this band and they're related to that band over there, then
Right.
they must be worth seeking out and investigating.
So I'm
100%.
curious, Clive, are you a musician yourself?
I'm not at all. I don't play anything. So no, just a fan.
Okay, okay. Yeah, and looking back at that collection behind you, now knowing that you're a Grateful Dead fan, I bet all of that is just the Grateful Dead releases right there.
There's quite a few there, quite a few, yeah.
All right. Well, we wanted to know that, so you came to hear about the Paisley Underground from your connections with different people. What made you think, hey, I want to put together a book about this scene?
I think that as time was going on, I felt that the Paisley Underground bands weren't really getting the recognition they deserved. Um, the Paisley Underground happened over here slightly later than it did in the US. I think probably, if people in the US were thinking 82, 83 was when the Paisley Underground was started up. Well, by the time some of the bands made it over here, you were kind of talking about 84, 85, so it's slightly later.
Okay.
And although they got a certain amount of press over here, the journalists writing for the weekly magazines tend to be a bit fickle. So they pick up on a band, maybe, and they'd run with them for a little while, then they drop them. And so I felt that the Paisley Underground bands weren't getting the recognition they deserved. And I felt that the scene ought to be kind of archived. There ought to be an archive created of them, because I had all these magazines with all these articles in, and I thought it'd be good to put them all into one place, put them in a book, and that would be a permanent resource. So that was part of the motivation. Something else really as well is that I was kind of so obsessed with them that I thought, if I had this project to do, maybe it kind of work its way through this obsession and I could get back to some sort of normalcy out of it.
I love that. I totally love that.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's great.
That's actually, it defines a number of us, I think, with a similar obsession
Yeah,
and focus.
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay, so I have to ask the question: how do you define the Paisley Underground? Because we have noticed through a number of forums on social media, where you are geographically tends to influence how you define that. So I'm asking you, Clive, how do you define the Paisley Underground?
Not an easy question to answer. First of all, it's location, which is Los Angeles, basically. Secondly, it's time period, 82, 83 in the USA. And also style of music, mainly psychedelic influence, punk influence, and also people who knew each other. So if you kind of take all those aspects, then to me that would define the Paisley Underground. But if you look at the bands I've selected, some of them weren't actually based in Los Angeles. Some of them were based elsewhere.
Mhm.
But I kind of put them in a group because of the various connections. So if I go through the bands which I've selected, I think probably somebody like the Dream Syndicate, the Rain Parade, and the Long Riders, they kind of pick themselves, really. I don't think anybody could really argue with those selections. A band like True West, again, I think they were basically came out of Davis, but they had connections to Los Angeles. And they were also a band which made it over to England in 1985. So they were sort of labeled Paisley Underground from that respect, really. A group which never actually made it to the UK was the 3 O'Clock. So they were slightly less well known over here. But of course, it was Michael Quercio's famous quote about his audience, which he called the Paisley Underground. So obviously, the 3 O'Clock had to be included in the book. One of the bands which are not in the book was, if you probably noticed, is the Bangles. Now, I would consider the Bangles to be one of the, key Paisley Underground bands. But the reason why they're not in the book is because they became relatively successful quite early on. And so there's not that much coverage in the fanzine press that I could find. They sort of quickly leapt to the weekly music press. So when I was trying to select articles for the book, I couldn't find many articles by them or about them.
Wow.
I found one in a magazine called Blitz, which I tried to track down the author to get permission to use that, but I couldn't track him down. The Bangles did have a fan club here in London, which I contacted because I thought maybe I could actually carry out some original interviews with them to get their story. But once the people in the office found out I wasn't a proper journalist, they didn't really want anything to do with me.
Okay.
So I had to reluctantly decide that I couldn't include the Bangles. So, I know obviously they're an important band in this scene, but they're not in the book, which is unfortunate. Perhaps the person who I felt was the key figure in the movement is David Roback, who was obviously present in the first lineup of the Rain Parade. But then as time went on, when he left the band, he moved through a number of different bands. So rather than have a section on each of the bands, I thought, well, I'd have a section on David Roback, where I included Clay Allison, Opal, and Mazzy Star. So that was the reason for him. There were a couple of, another band which were originally from Tucson, but moved to Los Angeles is Green on Red. And they came over and toured in England quite a bit in 1985. They were over here about 2 or 3 times. So they were quite well known over here. So they had to be included in the book as well. Now, then it gets a bit kind of fuzzy because there were a couple of bands which I selected, which you could argue maybe against if you were so minded. I was a big fan of Wednesday Week, so I wanted to put them in the book. They're perhaps not as well known as some of the other bands, but they had a very direct connection to Steve Wynn. So if you take the Dream Syndicate, you take Steve Wynn, you follow his early connections, you have a band called Goat Deity, which was him and the Callan sisters. So Wednesday Week made an 12-inch EP and an album on Enigma, which I really liked. So I was a fan of them, so I wanted to include them, so they're in the book. The band which are probably least well known of everybody in the book is 28th Day, who were from Chico, Northern California. Now I became aware of them because Pat Thomas had relocated to San Francisco, and he started a record label called Heyday Records, and he put out the album which Barbara Manning from 28th Day made, called Scissors. And he was sending me over tapes of Barbara Manning, so I was aware of Barbara Manning from Pat. Also, Nigel Cross from Bucket Full of Brains, he did reviews in one of the weekly magazines called Sounds, and he wrote a rave review of the 28th Day album in Sounds magazine. So I was aware of the 28th Day album, which I got from Plastic Passion in London sort of famous record shop in London, and it just sort of hit me sideways. It just totally blew me away. I really loved that record, and so I was a bit evangelical in terms of wanted to turn people onto that band.
I love that.
So yeah, so I was a big fan of 28th Day, and so that's the reason I wanted to include them in the book.
I love that. So it sounds to me like you attached yourself to the scene that you really loved, and then you were looking for adjacent connections and expanding on what that scene was by these various connections, whether it be Steve Wynn or what have you, right? So
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, there were other bands which I liked, which were vaguely connected, which didn't make the book. There was Game Theory, for example, from up in Sacramento, who I really liked, but I didn't think they were quite the style that most of the other bands. They weren't sort of a guitar band, for one thing. And although Scott Miller I thought he was a massive talent. He was a bit of a kind of a quirky songwriter, and they had this keyboard sound in Game Theory, so they didn't really fit what I thought was the archetypal Paisley Underground band.
okay.
There was also a band which again from Tucson called Naked Prey, who were a guitar band, and they were linked to Green on Red. So Band Christian was in an early incarnation of Green on Red, I think. So again, so you take Green on Red, you could follow them through to Naked Prey, but I'm afraid they didn't make the book either.
So you pick these different bands that were connected to the scene or that you wanted to promote or evangelize. I love using that word for in association with 28th Day. So your thought was you were going to compile all these. How did you go about getting all these articles, getting approval to use it? How did you compile all this to put together in this one book?
Well, I had, as a basis for the book, I had Bucketful of Brains. So that formed the backbone of the book, really, because I really loved Nigel Cross as a writer. I thought he was he's probably my second favorite writer of all time. There's a guy called Pete Frame in England who did a magazine called Zigzag in the late 60s and 70s, who's probably my favorite writer, but Nigel sort of runs him a close second, I think.
Nice.
So I wanted to put his writing in the book. There was also a magazine from the USA called The Bob, which you're probably familiar with, which is in kind of newspaper format.
Yes.
So that had a lot of articles on the Paisley Underground that I wanted to use. So they were the two main magazines, but I also had less well-known magazines. My friend Paul Ricketts, who I mentioned earlier, he'd started a magazine called Unhinged. I don't know if you've ever seen that magazine.
I'm not familiar with it.
It was sort of kind of running from the late 80s through the 90s.
Okay.
And it was a really good magazine, but it was quite eclectic. It would have the Paisley Underground bands in, but it might have an article on John Fay, or it might have an article on obscure science fiction author. So it was very varied, but there was good stuff in there. And what happened was because he was doing the magazine, he made some connections with various people. For example, Barbara Manning from 28th Day, she came over to Europe in 1992. She was doing a tour of Germany with her sister Terry. They were playing over in Germany, but they came over before that to England and had a bit of a holiday. So I had the privilege of hosting Barbara Manning in my house, playing a gig for me. So that was
wow.
having my in my front room playing for me. That was great.
That's amazing.
So, and what Paul had done, he just before she came over, he had written, or he had interviewed her in effect, but he was corresponding with Barbara. Now, what was happening was Barbara was writing him letters. Now, I think she thought she was writing him a letter as a friend, whereas Paul thought he was interviewing her. So what he did is he took the letter and he printed it in the magazine. And I think Barbara was kind of a bit surprised to see it in the magazine, so because it was quite confessional. And it's quite visceral, quite raw. If you read I've reprinted it in the book.
Right.
So I thought that was kind of the definitive story from Barbara on 28th Day. So
Right.
I was happy that I had that angle covered. But and also because Barbara had a solo album out, she'd done various other interviews which could be extracted. But the other two members of the band, Cole Markey and Mike Cloward, there wasn't really anything that I could use from them. So on a visit to San Francisco in 1992, I was there in the autumn in 92. So I decided to track down Michael and Cole and interview them. It so happened that at the time, Cole was actually living in San Francisco, and he was actually only a couple of blocks from where I was staying. So sort of one afternoon, I wandered around his place with the tape recorder, and I interviewed him to get his story, which I put in the book. And the same week, I interviewed Michael Cloud. Now, to get to him, I had to go up to Chico, which if you look at a map of the USA, Chico is quite close to San Francisco, but if you take a bus, it takes nearly all day to get up there.
Yeah.
So I had to do an overnight trip. So I stayed with Michael overnight and again interviewed him to get his side of the story, put that in the book. So I had a good time with him. He was getting me into bad habits like drinking cocktails in the morning, which I don't usually do. So that was how I got their side of the story. And as you know, the book is primarily a compilation of other people's work. But because I wanted to get 28th Day in there, I thought, well, you know, if I'm doing the book, I ought to write something in the book. So I decided to put my interviews with 28th Day in the book. And I also did the introduction to the band as well. If you notice, what I've done is, as well as compiling these archive articles, I got various people to do introductions to the band. So I selected people who I thought were particularly good at talking about certain bands. So, for example, Pat Thomas did Dream Syndicate because he's probably the world's leading authority on Dream Syndicate, even bigger one than Steve Wynn, maybe.
Absolutely.
Nigel Cross, who was associated with Rain Parade, I got him to do the Rain Parade introduction because by that time he was a friend of mine. Paul Ricketts, who put Wednesday Week in his magazine, I got him to do the Wednesday Week intro. There was a guy called Rick Gershon who was associated with the Long Riders. I can't remember exactly what his role was, but he was a friend of theirs. So he did the intro for the Long Riders. Who else was there? Fred Mills was a guy who did a lot of writing on Green on Red, so I got him to do Green on Red. And the Roback section, I got my friend Steve Lines to do that because he was a very big fan of David Roback, like myself, and I thought he knew what he was talking about when it came to David Roback, so he did the intro for that band. So that's where the selections came from, and so that's how it all came together. So what I needed to do was to actually track down these people and get their permission. So I thought I needed the permission of the authors of the articles, but I also wanted to make sure I had the permission of the people who owned the magazines.
Mm-hmm.
So I was kind of covered from that point of view. So when I was putting this book together, it was kind of pre-social media. Although the internet was there and you had email, there wasn't any Facebook, so it was quite difficult to track people down. So some of the people, Pat Thomas helped me find. So I managed over the course of, well, quite a period to get in touch with these people and get their permission to use the articles.
Okay.
So so that was all the material was gathered. So then I had to actually find a way of putting it all together. What I tried at first was to try and scan these articles and then put them into my computer. But what I found with that was that the software wasn't working very well. It was generating errors, so I had to go through and do a lot of corrections.
Oh boy.
So I thought, well, the easiest thing is to just actually type it. So I had to hand type everything from the magazines into my computer. So, you know, it's quite a big book.
Yes.
But I'm a person who's always used to getting up quite early in the morning. So what I used to do was get up early, and I'd spend maybe an hour or so typing up articles before I went to work. So I got all the stuff on my computer and put it into these various sections. And I was ready to go at one point. I should say that because I wanted to commission these new introductions, that did introduce a certain amount of delay into the project,
Right.
because I was waiting on people to provide them. I should also say that I wanted to use articles from fan magazines, from people who were kind of passionate about the music. And also because I was having to shell out money to produce a book, I didn't really want to pay people for their contributions. I thought, well, if they're music fans, they're not really worried about getting paid anyway, because they wouldn't have been paid for the original articles. So why should they worry about getting paid to have them reprinted? So
Right.
that was my opinion anyway. And everybody seemed quite happy to let me print their stuff. There's some articles in there from the later issues of Bucketful of Brains, and by that time, the editor of the magazine was a guy called John Story, and again, he was happy to give me permission to reprint the articles. So everything in the book is kind of reprinted by permission of the people who contributed them. I thought that I'd introduce a few photographs in the book, just to have a picture of each band. There's only one picture of each band, so it's sort of fairly minimal in terms of photographs, but I thought it'd be a good idea to have those. The only person I couldn't really find any suitable photographs was with David Roback, but I knew that a woman called Laura Levine had taken some pictures of Opal and Clay Allison. So I contacted her and asked her if I could use her pictures. Now she's actually a professional photographer, so she said, well, do you want to send me a contract for it? And I said, well, I don't really want to do that. You know, there's no money in it. But she kindly let me use one of her pictures if I sent her a couple of copies of the book. So that kind of worked out okay.
That's nice.
So when I had all the material ready, I should also say that perhaps the biggest cause of delay was I was waiting for the intro from Paul on Wednesday week. Now, Paul has got many virtues, but one of his characteristics is he's got a very relaxed attitude to deadlines. So it took him forever to get this article to me. So that did introduce a bit of delay. So this process actually went on, you know, it's probably a number of years putting all this stuff together.
Yeah, I was going to ask that, from the time that you had this thought to put this book together till the time that it was printed, how long are we talking in terms of?
Well, it was I was kind of mulling the concept over in the 90s, really, and the book was printed in 2006. So the actual book production of the book probably was spread over something like 3 years.
Okay.
So it did take a while. So then, having got all the material, I had to decide how I was going to actually get it printed. Now, nowadays, you can just upload stuff to Amazon and they'll do all the printing for you. And I think back in 2006, you could do print on demand books, but I didn't really want to do that because you can always kind of tell if a book's a print on demand book. Sure. I wanted it to look like a proper printed book, as it were. So it so happened that my cousin, her partner, ran a small print business, and he printed things like parish magazines and catalogues for stores, things like that. But he could actually print the book for me. So he was the one who did it, and I was quite happy with the way it turned out. I thought he did a pretty good job.
I agree.
So that's how the book came to be, really.
I mean, it's really impressive being able to cull together all these articles, articles that perhaps some fans, perhaps that came to know of the scene later, simply wouldn't have gotten their hands on.
That's right. Yeah. I mean,
but now we've
yeah.
got it all in one place.
It's unlikely that many people would have everything in the book. Obviously, some people would have Bucket Full of Brains and the Bob. They'd have all those articles.
Right.
But there was kind of more obscure things. For example, Nigel Cross did an article on a band called Going Home, which was Hope Sandoval's band originally, and they recorded an album which David Roback produced. And the only article I could find on them was in a German magazine called Heartbeat, which Nigel did for them. So that article is in the book, So there's probably a couple of things which most people hadn't seen before.
And I definitely think that's what makes the book unique, is that you've given fans things that are hard to find on your own, and you kind of made it very. Let me put it this way: as a fan who has a copy, it seems very easily done. And now listening to the process and the timeline, thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. And I'm curious, the book's out, you released the book in 2006, and what's the reaction that you receive? How is the book received?
Well, perhaps I should say, first of all, the economics of the book. I wanted to, obviously spent a lot of time on the book, but I wanted to actually spend some money on it, but get the money back. I didn't really want to be paying for the book out of my own pocket. So I wanted to cover my costs. So the book actually cost me £3,000 to have printed. So obviously when you get presented with 500 books, you need to pay up front. So that was £3,000 gone out my pocket.
Right.
So I decided what price I should sell the book for. And I had to I didn't want to price it out of the market. So I had to pitch it at a reasonable level. So bearing in mind that each book cost me £6 to produce, I thought £12 cover price was kind of a reasonable price to charge for it, which is fair enough, but that's £12 to the end consumer.
Right.
If I'm paying £6 and charging 12, that means I can't really go through any distributors because there's basically no margin in it for them. Or if there is a margin in it for them, I'm losing money on it. Right. So I couldn't distribute it by any third party. So the big drawback is that it's not available in shops. So if somebody read a review of it and they thought, oh, I'll go into my local bookshop and I'll pick it up, you can't find it in your local bookshop.
Right.
The only place that you'll find it was there was a few specialist outlets which took copies of the book. But I had to sell them myself, basically, by mail order or on eBay. So that was a way that it actually got out into the wild world, really. So in terms of the reaction to it, there were some good reviews. A lot of people really liked it who were into the Paisley Underground. What I found a little surprising was there were some people who I knew liked the Paisley Underground. They were into the music, but they seemed to be quite happy to live without the book. So from that, I learned that not everybody is like me. Not everybody needs to dig deep into these things. So, it was quite difficult to shift copies because of that business model which I've outlined. So in 2006, I had 500 copies of the book. So to date, I've probably given away about 100 copies. What I decided to do was to give all the contributors had a free copy and all the band members could have a free copy. Now, some of the bands I was in direct contact or indirect contact with, so I knew where to send their copies. Other band members, I didn't know where they were, so I couldn't send them a copy. A couple of them got in touch with me saying, can I buy a copy of the book? And I said, well, you know, you're in the band, I'll send you a free book. So and also my friends got free copies as well. So I probably gave away about 100 books with review copies.
Mm-hmm.
And to date, I've probably sold about 350. So that means I probably just about made my money back, or maybe a bit more. And I've got about 50 copies still left in my wardrobe.
All right.
You have one less from
I
last
know. We both have our own, but
Yeah.
So I want to. Oh, go ahead, Soraya.
I just wanted to know, just really quickly, knowing that there's about 50 copies, what if if our listeners would like a copy, what's the best avenue to contact you?
They can, if they look on eBay and they search for either Tell Me When It's Over or Paisley Underground book, they'll find it on there. Or they can find me on Facebook directly, Clive Jones. Look for me on Facebook. We probably have mutual friends if you're listening to this podcast.
Yes, absolutely.
They can get in touch with me that way.
Perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to share my personal story. It was about 3 years ago that one of my friends, Tori Troutman, who's one of my good friends and a bandmate of mine, he sent me this copy from Oklahoma. And he said, Jeff, you have to read this. So I spent my lunch breaks for the next week and a half just devouring the book. So I actually loved it. And I said, thank you for the gift, Tori. He's like, oh, no, it's not a gift. You need to send it back, but I wanted you to read it. Only last month I finally reached out to you, Clive, and you were
right
to send me a copy. And I don't know if you're willing to do this to our listeners, but if any listeners want to order it through eBay from Clive, I asked Clive to actually sign my copy. So
yeah, no problem.
Yeah, so maybe that's something that you could do for our listeners. So
Certainly.
I learned at the beginning of the hour that you are not the author of all these British history books that I found. Is this the only book that you've put together, or have you put together other?
It's the only book. It's the only book I've put together.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great.
I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you enjoy the book. There's basically two reactions that I want to generate from the book.
okay.
One is, oh, I really loved it. Thank you for doing it, which is kind of the reaction I got from yours. And the other is, this book is an outrage. This person doesn't know what he's talking about. I must do my own book, and I'll tell the real story. Which would mean that there'd be another Paisley Underground book out there, which I could buy, read, and enjoy.
Well, to date,
This is it.
got this.
I think that's it. There's a guy called Carlos or Carlo in Spain who's written a book in Spanish, which covers this scene, but it's a bit wider than that.
Yes, I know exactly the book you're talking about. I thought I had it here.
You have it, yeah.
And his definition is a little different.
It's a lot broader than mine, yeah.
And I will say, the detail, and especially, the section connected to and through David Roback. His book is a little different than that.
Sorry, I had a question for you. I know we're interviewing Clive here, but if I look at the side of mine, it looks pretty smooth. You've got things sticking out of your version.
Look, Clive, you need to understand. One, I teach for a living. And so when I read things, I mark things and I make notes to myself. The books become a part of me. So yes.
It looks like a proper textbook.
That's simply the way I read. And so, I highlighted things, I make notes to myself in the margin. I'm just one of those kind of readers. You never, like your friend Jeff asked you, send it back. Your friend would hate me after I went through a book.
Yeah, it's good to see.
An extra copy.
Oh, excellent. So Clive, is there anything that you're working on now, or anything that you wanted to share with our listeners about?
There's probably nothing right now, but I could tell you about some of the other things I've been involved with. I've talked about my friend Steve Lines, who lives locally. He has a band called Storm Clouds, who I'm a big fan of, which is basically him and a female singer. So we formed a record label to put out his music primarily. And so we put out a couple of albums by him. This album here called Nightmares in the Sky, which is out on vinyl and CD.
Storm.
And second album by Storm Clouds is called Sleep No More, again on vinyl and CD. So that was quite an interesting project. That was back in the 90s we did those, or maybe early 2000s.
Again, what was the label?
It's called Rainfall Records is the label.
Okay.
And the band is called Storm Clouds. A little after that, I put out a couple of albums with Pat Thomas, whereas I was kind of supplying the finance and Pat was doing the work for them. So I put out this record by the Rain Parade, which is called Perfume River. Are you familiar with that album?
Yes.
Yes.
We
Okay,
are.
so that's on my label, Rainfall Records, the label I run with Steve. That's getting quite rare now, not many of those around.
Yes, indeed.
And the sort of project after that was this album by Barbara Manning called Super Scissors. Do you know that record?
No, I'm not familiar with Super Scissors.
Right, so what this is this is a 3 CD box set. It's got the Lately I Keep Scissors album. It's got the One Perfect Green Blanket album, which has got a bunch of extra tracks on that CD. And then CD number 3 is all unreleased material from the era of Scissors. So that's why it's called Super Scissors.
Excellent.
It's got a nice little booklet in it. And it's got 3 separate CDs with separate covers in the box.
Love
So
that.
yeah, quite a nice little artifact.
And again, that can be purchased through Rainfall Records.
There's probably not many. There's not many of those left now. So you can probably find it on Discogs and maybe eBay. So particularly people in the USA, it's probably easiest to look for those on Discogs, I would imagine.
Okay.
That's where I'm heading right now.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm gonna beat you to it because that looks spectacular.
Yes, it does.
And that third CD, I'm super curious.
Yes.
Very, very curious.
Yeah, it's some great stuff on there. Yeah, a very amusing interview with Barbara is the bonus track on the Scissors CD. She did a very amusing interview on KZSU radio.
Yeah, we're big fans of Barbara. We had her on recently and she was a blast.
I listened to your 28th Day special. I found it very interesting.
Yeah,
So it was excellent. You managed to get all 3 of them together.
That was all Barbara.
Yeah.
We reached out to Barbara and she managed to pull the whole band together. So
yeah. I managed to get over there for a reunion I think it was 2004. They played 2 reunion shows, one in San Francisco and one up in Chico. And so I managed to come over for those. So that was a great thrill to see that band.
Wow. And how did they sound as a reunited band?
They sounded absolutely great. Yeah. They did all the old classics.
Nice.
See, Clive's my kind of fan.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because Clive not only listens to the music, follows the band, but also is very proactive in getting them to speak. I like it. Clive. My kind of fan.
Yes. So from one music fan to another music fan, Clive, we really wanted to thank you for taking time. I really enjoyed talking to you today. It was very eye-opening on how you put this together and the bands that you chose. I always wondered about that, how you came to choose the bands that you did. And listening to you today, it makes perfect sense. And having that geographical distance of being so far away from Los Angeles, I was just curious how all this came together in a time when you can't Google things as easily as we can today. And as Soraya mentioned, it's really nice as a fan to have all these compiled together in one thing that I can hold in one hand. So I really appreciate that. And I appreciate your time today, Clive.
Okay, well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you both.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Yep.
And have a good evening.
Yes.
Thank you.
Soraya, let's go get lunch.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you, Clive. Really appreciate it. So, Soraya, now we have a little bit more understanding of how this came together.
Okay. So yes, now I understand the why, okay? Because he said it. That for him, because I think when I read the book, I said, why is there so much Clay Allison, Opal, Going Home, Mazzy Star? That was a section that I couldn't wrap my head around it. But he said for him, David Roback was a key person to this movement, to this scene. And I go, okay, now I understand why you include it. And then the fact that he's able to put something in there that's really quite rare about going home. Now, I want to read one thing, just one little thing. And this is where I was coming into this from. So this is from the foreword that Pat Thomas writes to the book.
Okay.
And he says, Clive and I share, this is about, it's still open to debate who exactly the Paisley Underground bands were. Basically, Clive and I share what I would call a, quote, bucket full of brains, end quote, view, which really was the premier source of information for this sound. Even though the music was, parentheses, open parentheses, mostly, in parentheses, based in Los Angeles, and the magazine was published in London. Okay, so think about that geographic distance, right? For those of us living in the 80s on the East Coast, me, or in the UK, Clive, we saw the scope of bands a little wider than someone living in LA. And I think this is really the key difference. We've spoken to all, almost, or as many of the band members as we can from these seminal 4 Paisley Underground bands that you and I define as the 4. Bangles, 3 O'Clock, Dream Syndicate, Rain Parade. Okay, Sid Griffin even backs us up in John Doe's book. Yes, thank you. Represent. But the further away you get from Los Angeles, this is where things change. And I think Pat Thomas makes a really interesting argument about that. And I can't say that I disagree. So, but he continues. Those people lucky enough to be in LA back then probably wouldn't include True West. Okay, and you and I have talked about this. They were from Northern California, but had strong ties to the Dream Syndicate. But every fan and nearly every journalist living outside of California probably would. So I think you and I have a unique perspective because, we're Southern California people and we see it one way. We see it in the way that Danny Benaire and everybody else kind of sees it. But then the minute you walk out, people they have a little more perspective. And I think like you and I have talked about it and we've seen in online forums like, no, the Paisley Underground is 4 bands. That's it. Nobody else. And I used to get so riled up when people would include people that I thought, me, Soraya Allender, I thought simply just weren't a part of this scene. And I, because I keep thinking about Danny Benaire. Danny Benaire said, there are 4 bands that were part of this scene. You know them, Dream Syndicate, Rain Parade, 3 O'Clock Bangles. And I would get so angry when people in Europe would say, no, Opal's a part of it. No, they're not. And I remember thinking, why? It's so crazy. But I think Pat and Clive have really kind of presented, we see it a little differently, and this is why. And for Clive, he sees a lot of connections because what you and I term as going down the rabbit hole, Clive sees as merely like, they're bridges to other bands. And I thought that was just an interesting perspective hearing him say it.
Yes.
So, a couple of weeks ago, it was somebody made the argument that REM was part of it. And I remember, no, but look, Pat says something about it too. Pat Thomas says in the foreword, he goes, so he mentions how Clive sees it one way, he sees it another. Some things Clive included, he wouldn't have included, but I think Clive argued that there are certain connections to to people in the seminal bands that led to him including these. So, and then Pat adds this perfect line. This is why Pat Thomas nailed it. And despite what Mojo magazine wrote a few years ago, REM was never a Paisley Underground band! Exclamation point. And he adds, although they did share Wine, Women, and Song with many from the Paisley Underground collective. But then I think Clive made a really interesting point when he said, you know, I put out this book and some people that I knew were fans simply weren't interested. They wanted nothing. They did not want a book. And so Pat Thomas adds this one line. He says, as Ricky Nelson sang, quote, you can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself, end quote. This book is Clive's personal pick of bands with a bit of my input. So I now get it. I now have I have clarity, right, on Clive's view. And, but I still think, and I mean, hats off to this guy for transcribing so many articles. I can't even imagine. But if you're a fan of Paisley Underground bands, what he's done is he's given us access to articles that a while ago would have been hard to kind of dig up, and he's put them all in one place.
Yep.
You know,
yeah, I wanted to reiterate, as you said and he said, so the book is primarily just a collection of previously written articles, not so much where he sat out and authored a bunch of stuff. There was some of that is included, but primarily a collection of previously.
Can you hold on one second, because I want to show you the book that he was talking about.
Oh yeah, I was very curious about that, especially when he said that it was written in Spanish. So
I used to have it here on my desk.
Oh.
But I've been reading it, so it's on my nightstand.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So the name of the author is Carlos Rego. And I already have a problem with the title because they call it Nuevo Rock Americano Años 80. So they're saying the new American rock.
Of the 80s.
Of the 80s. Luces y sombras de un espejismo. Lights, it's like lights and shadows of a reflection. Okay, but listen to the bands that he puts in here, okay? Rain Parade, Green on Red.
I'm on board.
Dream Syndicate.
On board.
Long Riders.
Still on board.
Violent Femmes.
Wait, what?
Los Lobos. The Del Lords. Jason and the Scorchers. Giant Sand. REM. Okay, so Carlos had me, he's got me in some places. So Carlos's argument is a little different. And look, I just, also mentions other bands. You know, there's our friend, the one and only Michael Curcio.
With a guitar, not a bass, a 6-string guitar.
Yeah, but yeah, this is he makes a very different argument. Not like different, but he approaches it in a different way. And it just goes to show you, it's all a question of perspective.
Yep.
And what are the links, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, me and Carlos don't see things completely eye to eye. And I saw the mention of this book in one of the online pages on Facebook, something Paisley Underground related. And I said, okay, I got to read this book. And so I ordered it, and it was sitting for a while until I was done with the semester. And so I've been starting to read it.
Interesting. I brought that up. So
yeah.
And before we sign off, I did want to bring up Clive's point when we were asking about the reaction to it. And he said, I am looking for 2 reactions. 1, I love the book and thank you. And 2, this was terrible. I'm going to get it right and write my own book. So for any of you out there that have issues with this book, please put pen to paper and write one that's better. I can't do it. So, but
Look,
yeah,
look, the fact that he's found these articles, put them together, and given it to us, that's a plus. Do we need something that digs deeper? Sure. How many times? Who have we talked to? We've talked to Danny Benair. We've talked to Lena Lee Tonma. We've talked to Michael Corcio. We've talked with Steve Wynn. We've talked with Matt Pucci, with Stephen Roback. I don't know, Jeff. Do we need to write a book?
are we authors or podcasters?
I think we're
both.
podcasters. We're fans. I'm not a musician. You are, but you know, one of the things that I find really interesting is this is a topic that is still of interest, right? Look at us. We're sitting here, what, a year and change after sitting down to just talk about music we like. And what we're finding is there's a lot of layers here that simply haven't been uncovered, or maybe, you know, people haven't taken the time to do it. I don't know. But Clive's point, I think, is really well taken. Hey, got an issue? Figure it out and write something else, and let me sit and read it.
Love that.
I'm down.
Yeah.
So you know, I don't want to say pestered, but I've mentioned repeatedly to Lena Lee Tonma, I think we're ready for her book.
I certainly.
Anybody else that has inside info and kind of lived the tale, we're ready for your book.
Yeah. And until that book comes out, if you want to go to eBay, look for Tell Me When It's Over.
There are only 50 copies left.
Notes
you want this in your...
Yep.
You're not going to go dig in the archives, bucket full of bricks, the Bob, Blitz. I was just writing down, you know, magazines. I'm like, okay, Zigzag, Unhinged.
Right? Yep.
And if you are, let us know, because we want to read your book. And we want scanned copies of all the articles.
Yes. And if you buy it on eBay, you're buying it directly from Clive. If you're interested, like I did, ask him to sign it. He said he'd be willing to sign it if you're into such things. But eBay, Tell Me When It's Over, Notes from the Paisley Underground, edited by Clive Jones. If you're into the scene as we are, and you're listening to our podcast, you probably are. I think it's worth checking out.
Read. It's honestly worth a read. And the bands covered are Dream Syndicate, 3 O'Clock, True West, Long Riders, Green on Red, Wednesday Week, 28th Day, Rain Parade, and then that one last section that I always had an issue with, Clay Allison, Opal, Going Home, and Massive Star.
Yep.
And a bunch of articles, you know, it's worth your time.
Agreed. Clive,
and then you can tell us your opinion after.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, mi gente, a groovy.
Groove on, Paisley people.